less technological their society is, that they're not trying to pitch all kinds of new products for them to buy every single minute, or they certainly weren't visible in the store. We're entering the age of synthetic biology, where people will be creating their own little animals and stuff. And I actually think that with the viewpoint of the vegan people, that we're going to just end up growing flesh, and we're going to get rid of all animals. We won't have them anymore because it will be easier just to grow the flesh directly. And that's why it's better to sort of go back to having small farms and not having all this kind of weird stuff that we're eating. Anyway, that's what I
David.
I should say, having taken actually Professor Sanders' class last fall, one of the arguments that I would be interested to hear both sides touch upon is whether or not sort of animal life and whether or not they have consciousness or personality or any sense of awareness over time, whether or not that really does play into both sides. I mean, I think it certainly does on the animal rights side, but I would also be interested to hear the opposition side in terms of whether or not animal consciousness and therefore animal personhood per se is relevant to whether or not he is or is not.
Somebody from each side give a quick answer.
Okay. So very quickly, I think being a person certainly isn't required to be morally relevant, but not just being a person, but being a human matters. And one place in which I disagree with Professor Singer is I do think the species category is important. When we recognize people as being part of the moral community, we hadn't recognized being part of the moral community before, it's very important that recognition wasn't the recognition of personhood, it was the recognition of humanity. When the Roman playwright Terence, who the Renaissance humanists like to quote, "I am human, nothing human is alien to me," what he was talking about was the recognition of common experience, which wasn't just sharing features which would always be attendant on personhood. It was common humanity, it was common experiences of living under the shadow of death, of mourning, of love, of certain things. Those things matter, and it seems to be wholly proper to treat people differently because they are, in an important sense, us. So that's not a license to do whatever you want with people who fall outside that category. But I think the idea that that's a mere prejudice is a mistake.
Well, I disagree with the viewpoint that simply being a member of the species Homo sapien can really make a crucial moral difference. It may be that having some cognitive capacities, higher level self-awareness makes a difference in some ways, but I agree with the Bentham quote that we had before, that suffering is really the bottom line. That's what matters. And for those who think, oh no, it's some higher level of rationality or self-awareness that's important, you have to ask yourself, would we be prepared to treat members of our species who don't have those cognitive capacities in the same way we now treat animals? So unfortunately, there are humans born with severe brain damage, perhaps a genetic condition, perhaps they didn't get enough oxygen during birth, and their brain has been so damaged that we know that they will never rise to the level of self-awareness that is normal for humans, or even that is superior to that of a pig or one of the animals we eat. But we would never countenance treating them just as objects without really considering their whatever welfare they can have in order to be convenient for us in terms of what we eat. So I think we ought to reject the idea that just membership of our species is somehow morally decisive in how we can treat different beings.
I would take some from people who you've had a chance to speak already. Did I see Raphael? I see your hand?
My question is for the vegetarian side. And I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk, especially in the initial presentation, about various levels of resource usage, and there seemed to be an implication there that matters. And that stop me if I'm taking your argument too far, but it seems to me that the implicit argument is that when you have an African family that's living on, let's say, $1 a day, if we were to grow, eat corn, eat maize, eat vegetarian instead of eating meat, that this would somehow impact them, and that their lives would be better. They'd have access to cheaper food. And I'm not an economist, I'm not a political scientist. I have read some stuff, some political science on this matter, and it really does major violence to that argument. It just says that the problems that sub-Saharan African families are facing are not related to the fact that we have cheap, they just have nothing to do with each other. So I'm wondering if the vegetarian side, if I characterize your argument correctly, and whether the leap that I took is correct.
You did characterize the argument correctly. And you know, this became a really hot topic in the UK about 2 years ago when the UN Special Envoy on Food called it a human rights crime that 100 million metric tons of grain and corn are turned into biofuels. And the numbers were crunched, and they found that that competition for grain drove up the price of grain and corn by more than 20% for the billion people who are starving. She said that's a human rights crime. The same UN FAO report found that 756 million metric tons of grain and corn were being fed to farmed animals, and more than 200 million metric tons of soy are being fed to farmed animals, more than 98% of all soy grown fed to farmed animals. So the World Watch Institute, agricultural economists with the World Bank, put out a report, and they said meat consumption is an inefficient use of grain. The grain is used more efficiently when consumed by humans. Continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the world's poor, unquote. It's something Paul Krugman talks about, although he tends to look at increased meat consumption in China and India, but the exact same argument applies to our vastly greater meat consumption here. There's a finite amount of grain and corn and soy. If we're feeding it to farmed animals, as the Greenpeace banner makes clear, KFC, Amazon, criminal, that means the billion people who don't have enough money to buy anything to eat, it drives up the price of food for them, and we literally, in a very real way, contribute to their starvation. In addition to just doing something that requires so many more resources than something else. Both of those independently are the reason that I stopped eating meat 23 years ago.
Raphael has read some stuff. We have time for just a few more. I know there are a lot of people who want to speak, so let's go to this side of the room.
The argument was made by the opposition that somehow the industry's relationship with certain populations of animals has been beneficial to the number of animals, but I think that, in consideration of the treatment of those animals, like, yeah, there are more of them, but a lot of them are almost packed, so I think it comes on to
Let's get maybe two more. David?
Yeah, I'd just like to talk about the moral value of suffering, which you brought up, speakers and others who brought up the question. Clearly, well, there seems to be a strange leap of logic that the opposition takes, that granted we have the intuition that other things being equal, suffering is bad. This means that suffering has to be eliminated no matter what. But I think that I would certainly agree that suffering is something that